Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the second event in our cycle of conversations on Chinese philosophy, a virtual symposium co-organized by the University of Naples, L'Orientale, and the University of Tallinn, Tallinn University. And I'm very happy to introduce to the audience today a friend and a colleague. She's also one of the co-organizers, together with me and Chiara Ghidini, of this cycle, Lisa Indraccolo. She earned her PhD at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. She then worked for several years at the University of Zurich, where she focused on two projects, if I'm not wrong, one on persuasion in early Chinese philosophy, and then the second one on the rhetoric expedience in the rhetoric structure of the Han States. And now she's associate professor of Chinese studies at Tallinn University. She works mainly on Chinese early philosophy, philology, so she is a very careful researcher on the textual characteristics and, of course, the philosophical contents of this of some of the masterpieces of Chinese early philosophy, but also on some lesser known texts on which she has worked extensively. And today she will give a lecture titled Civil Disobedience, Agency, and Moral Authority in Early Chinese Philosophy. I'm very curious to hear from her. And so as said, I would ask all the participants to switch their cameras and microphones off during Lisa's presentation. And then during the Q&A session, of course, we can switch them on again. There will be time for questions, and you can use either the chat box here on Microsoft Teams, or you can raise your hand and ask the question directly to the speaker. So Lisa, the floor is yours, and thanks again, and see you later for the Q&A.
Federico, thank you so much for the invitation, of course, to become part of the organizing team as well, and to Chiara, of course, for this opportunity to give this talk as part of this lecture series, and also for the very generous introduction. So I don't want to waste too much time, so let's move on with the talk. I will share my screen. I have a few slides, but don't worry, nothing too heavy. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so, all right. So, in classical Chinese political philosophical thought, the right to reign is notoriously bestowed by superior omniscient power, typically identified as heaven or the sky above, upon a chosen one. At least in theory, this privileged human being in heaven's favor does not need to be a direct descendant of the ruler in charge, nor to necessarily belong to his bloodline or to an aristocratic lineage. Rather, his suitability to reign should ideally be judged on a completely different ground, that is, on his ethical qualities, his moral rectitude and integrity. Such an ideal and idealized ruler is portrayed by a group of mythological and semi-mythological pre-dynastic figures, the sage kings of old. According to the tradition, the period of reign of these ancient kingly figures would correspond to the apex of Chinese civilization. The sage kings are an omnipresent rhetorical trope in classical Chinese literature. They come to embody the highest possible degree of virtue conceivable, which remains basically unattainable for the average human and almost out of reach even for the most accomplished human beings, to the point that even Confucius in the dialogues notoriously denies to have attained sagehood himself, and to be deigned to be compared to them. At the same time, with their example, the sage kings set the ultimate moral standards of an Edenic past against the contemporary world, ruled by corrupted and depraved hegemons, tyrants, and usurpers who take power by force and only crave to satisfy their selfish desires and ruthlessly pursue expansionistic policies. The ruler-elect has to be an exceptional individual, an epitome and a paladin of virtue. He has the duty and the privilege to interpret heaven's will and to make it manifest to the world through his behavior and his actions. And what is most important to our discussion here today, to adequately cater for the local population and to satisfy their most basic needs, as he is entrusted with their care and safekeeping. Still, despite having numinous origins, this mandate to rule, or mandate of heaven, is neither absolute nor indefinite. It can be revoked any time, and an unworthy ruler should consequently be removed, even forcibly with the use of violence under extreme circumstances. Actually, Tianming is a polysemic word which can be variously interpreted as meaning heavenly given destiny, decrees of heaven, or mandate of heaven. As heavenly given destiny, it includes both the natural endowment of inborn qualities and characteristics received by heaven as a personal dowry at birth, and the predetermined constellation of events that are supposedly going to trace the course of one's person's life. As a decree of heaven, we mean the superior command or order expressing the unquestionable will of heaven, the political but also spiritual and moral guidance offered to the ruler of men under the form of unspoken orders. These are communicated exclusively to a sovereign who enjoys the favor and the protection of heaven, and only as long as he does so, a key issue that will be at the center of our discourse today. This is the only possible way in which heaven can make its presence manifest and to a certain extent intelligible to humans. Thus, the king first and the emperor thereafter have the prerogative of enjoying an exclusive direct channel of supernatural communication with the supreme deity, and are emissaries on earth and embodiments of heaven's will. This is often communicated as veiled allegorical messages through mystic or premonitory dreams, marvelous events and omens, or as natural events, either catastrophic or wondrous. Finally, the last meaning of Tianming as mandate of heaven is referred to the sacred and sacred right to govern over people and the whole world, all under heaven. The mandate theoretically cannot be conquered, appropriated, or taken by force. It can only be graciously bestowed by heaven upon a chosen one. Someone who is an intellectually and morally superior human being endowed with exceptional clairvoyance, farsightedness, and humaneness, an enlightened mind with a heightened sensitivity and responsiveness to events, who has distinguished himself for his exceptional virtue and his disinterested service to the people. A ruler in his exceptionality would of course be the receiver of all three kinds of Tianming at the same time: an heavenly given destiny as all his fellow human beings, the decree of heaven in virtue of his position and medianic relationship to heaven, and as the mandate of heaven, as the only and exclusive receptacle of heaven's potency that is expressed through him. The mandate of heaven is the fundamental superior teleological guiding principle regulating political activity and state organization in all its aspects, and at the same time is at the basis of the power succession system. Possessing and especially being able to maintain the prerogative embodying and translating heaven's will to the people in a way and in a language they can understand is the fundamental discriminant factor in preserving power or being overthrown, as we will see in more detail later on. It is in this latter, more political meaning that we will be examining Tianming today. The mandate of heaven is often considered to be a stronghold of Confucian thought at large, and a widely accepted concept deeply rooted in warring state philosophical thought. However, this is not quite the case. At a closer look, most philosophical master's texts of the period barely mention Tianming at all. The Analects, somewhat surprisingly, only mention it twice, despite the fact that Confucius, together with Mencius, is often claimed to be a strong supporter of the principle of Tianming. Also, in both occurrences, Tianming assumes rather the meaning of decree of heaven than mandate. In the second chapter of Wei Zheng, we read about the master doing a brief life review. The master said, At the age of 15, I was able to set my mind steadily on studying. At the age of 30, I had become firmly established. At the age of 40, I had no more doubts. At the age of 50, I was capable of grasping the decrees of heaven, the Tianming. At the age of 60, my ears were perfectly attuned. At the age of 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing any fundamental rules. And in chapter 16, 及时, the master said, for the gentleman, there are three sources of awe. He is in awe of heaven's decrees. He is in awe of greater men. He is in awe of the teachings of the sages. The petty man is unaware of heaven's decrees. Hence, he is not in awe of them. He behaves inappropriately towards great men, and he disrespects the teachings of the sages. Even another fundamental Confucian text, the Xunzi, only mentions Tianming once, despite being a relatively substantial text. So do the Hanfeizi and even the Laozi, for instance, and there is no occurrence of it at all in the Zhuangzi, just to name some of the most well-studied texts belonging to this cluster of philosophical collections. The early Chinese texts that actually make a consistent use of the concept of Tianming, with all its implications for rulership and succession, are the Mengzi, the Lun Han, composed by the Eastern Han scholar Wang Chong, and the Yanzi Fayan. Actually, the Mozi also pays quite some attention to the issue of Tianming. However, this is meant as fate or destiny rather than mandate of heaven in its more political connotation. Accordingly, the text problematizes the role and range of influence that Tianming allegedly would have in determining the course of someone's life, heavily criticizing the idea of predestination that is closely associated with Confucianism in the rather evocative chapters Against Destiny, Fei Ming, and Against the Rule. We can notice a gap, a time window, between the earliest instances of the concept of Tianming that is mentioned especially in the odes and the Shi and the documents, the Shu, but as an unfathomable supreme power that acts in inscrutable ways and determines people's destiny rather than as mandate of heaven, and the way in which Tianming is represented and conceptualized in the pre-imperial period, where it seemingly plays a relatively secondary role, and finally its revival in the early imperial period. We might tentatively conclude that, as textual evidence suggests, it is not until the establishment of the centralized empire that the concept of Tianming as mandate of heaven is consistently employed and becomes fully integrated into the contemporary historical and philosophical discourse. Tianming features prominently also in both the two dynastic histories of the Han, providing evidence of how this concept has been strategically employed in the imperial narrative and has evidently played a cardinal role in the gradual process of the legitimation of power and the ideological setup of the empire. Seemingly, during the interregnum of the warring states, the concept of mandate of heaven plays a relatively less important role. This is one of the historical periods that, as we know, is most strongly characterized by increased social and physical mobility, by the disruption of the political status quo and of borders and boundaries between states, but also between different intellectual trends. The wandering persuader and intellectual, but eventually also the newly established rulers, conceptualize themselves as a faber fortunae suae. Every man is artifacts of his destiny, who does not easily resign themselves to rely on, or at least is far less inclined to willingly and blindly submit themselves to, the at times inscrutable will of a supreme deity to establish their own destiny. This way of thinking would be very much in line with pragmatically oriented thinkers of the time, such as, for instance, Hanfeizi or Xunzi. In this intellectual landscape, it is the Mencius that apparently starts a revival and the revitalization of the concept of Tianming with a twist. Not only does the concept of the mandate of heaven play a fundamental role in the political philosophical agenda of the Mencius, the text also goes one step further and arrives to the point of endorsing, justifying, and even condoning the dethronement of an unrighteous ruler. Actually, this idea, or at least the fundamental principle on which it is based, is not completely new in the contemporary intellectual landscape. In early Chinese texts, the right to officially remonstrate, to more or less openly criticize a ruler or a superior and to resist against an institutionalized power that has somehow lost its way and betrayed its subjects is not only openly theorized and to a certain extent promoted as a healthy way of actively participating in political life. It is even considered a moral imperative in the case of an official directly involved in government practice. Challenging the mandate of heaven, if we may borrow here the title of Elizabeth Perry's book from 2002, is a concept deeply rooted in the Chinese intellectual tradition. However, dissent, whether formulated in written or oral form, must always be expressed through the appropriate official channels, framed within a certain format and formulated in a way that abides by more or less fixed set of formal and compositional rules that ensure its social, political, and moral acceptability. Dissent is never a haphazard extemporaneous eruption of unrestrained verbal or physical violence. It is regulated by and modulated according to the same system of behavioral norms within which even rebellion germinates, or is at times orchestrated. Through a process of internal normalization, even rebellious leaders could eventually be reabsorbed within the orderly institutional system, as long as they're willing to acknowledge and comply with the new status quo that they have actively contributed to establish. In this way, constituted order is preserved through change without being truly subverted, nor are the premises on which power is based ever challenged to their core in any meaningful way. This basic principle regulating the expression of dissent disproved to a larger extent attempts to ascribe a tentatively democratic or egalitarian quality to early Chinese forms of government, as we will see in more detail below. Several modern interpretations of certain passages in which the potential for and the concept of popular upheaval is openly debated in early Chinese political philosophical texts in general, and in the Manchus in particular, have claimed that the proper right of revolution or right to rebel would be granted to the people. What is meant here by right to rebel is consistent with the definition given by Tony Honoré of one of three types of justifiable rebellious processes in the taxonomy he provides in the eponymous article entitled The Right to Rebel, that is, quote, the right of individual or group to resort to violence, if necessary on a large scale, to secure on behalf of individuals or groups conceived as exploited or oppressed a change in the government, structures, or policies of the society to which they belong, radical rebellion, unquote. Such right could and should be actively exercised whenever satisfaction of most basic human needs is not granted, and therefore decorous living conditions are no more guaranteed due to the ineptitude or the deliberate carelessness of the sovereign. However, this kind of interpretation is under certain aspects problematic, as it implies that people would enjoy a high degree of freedom and autonomy in both their thinking and actions. As will be shown, common people are eventually rather to be considered instruments, either indirectly of heavenly superior powers or directly of a charismatic leader, either a peer enjoying the same social status or a member of the social elite, rather than fully autonomous and conscious agents in the rebellious process. By taking the Manchus as a case study, I will now try to delineate a narrative of popular dissent and to problematize the concept of justifiable rebellion in early China. So as we know, the Manchus is an early Chinese political philosophical collection in 7 chapters, closely associated with the Confucian tradition. The text allegedly dates back to the Warring States and is traditionally attributed to the eponymous thinker, Mengzi or Manchus. Without going in too deep into complicated matters of textual history, we can say that the core of the Manchus most probably dates back to this early period, but the received text as a whole in its present form must have undergone a fairly extensive process of editing and internal reorganization during the Han. Hence, due to its multi-layered textual history, it is rather to be considered as an early imperial cultural product. The authorship of the Mencius is an even thornier issue, as the attribution of the text to Mencius himself is highly controversial. However, we can say with a certain degree of confidence that the collection has most probably been compiled after the death of Mencius, possibly by a group of his disciples. It is highly unlikely that the philosopher himself might have authored even parts of the text as we know it today. The Mencius is well known especially for the dialogues that Mencius entertains at court with local rulers. In pursuing his own political philosophical agenda, on several occasions, Mencius strongly advocates in favor of and suggests concrete means to improve the living conditions of the population through the establishment of an ethical government, up to the standards set by the example of the legendary sage kings of old. As it has already been mentioned, a true king is expected to be an epitome of virtue and to always behave accordingly. He exudes his virtue in an unspoken and unspeakable way, tacitly influencing the behavior of his people. In this respect, the Confucian socio-political agenda can be tentatively considered as an attempt at social engineering. The supreme goal in an ideal world and under optimal conditions would ultimately be the establishment of an organically integrated functional society. Through his example, a true king indirectly educates, disciplines, and guides the inclination of his people, more or less gently imposing a firm direction on their life and directing them towards the pursuit of the supreme good, the establishment of a harmonious society and government based on a web of 5 basic virtuous interhuman relationships. A clear distinction, however, must be drawn here between the ideal figure of the morally and intellectually superior and fully accomplished true king and the blatantly put second-choice human material that Mencius has to deal with in the different dialogues and anecdotes preserved in the eponymous text. The kind of ruler we're talking about in the Warring States period, and that we find depicted as a type in the received philosophical literature, is not even vaguely reminiscent of the exemplary kingly figures from the past, of whom he is barely a grotesque caricature animated by morally distorted ideals. He is a ruthless tyrant whose primary interest is to satisfy his own wildest, unrestrained desires, consolidate his power and authority within any available means, and enlarge his domains. Still, as we have already seen, even the ideal ruler advocated by the Confucian tradition is not immune from criticism. He is neither omnipotent nor irreplaceable, and can be overthrown in the moment in which he fails to correctly interpret, embody, and translate into visible action the will of heaven in the human world. Eventually, the discriminating factor to determine whether a ruler is correctly performing his role, thereby embodying heaven's decrees through his virtuous actions, is represented by the degree of satisfaction and the actual well-being of his people. This represents the ultimate criterion against which to judge the actions, behavior, and eventually the moral stance of a ruler. As Mencius explicitly states, Mencius said, "The people are the most important, the gods of soil and grain come second, the ruler is the least important. Therefore, if you conquer the heart of the people, you will become son of heaven. If you conquer the heart of the son of heaven, you will become a lord. If you conquer the heart of a lord, you will become a higher official." In order for a ruler to preserve the favors that heaven has bestowed upon him, hence to preserve his rule, he has to ensure that he appropriately and satisfactorily caters for his people's needs. The most basic natural needs of his people have to be met and satisfied. That means, first and foremost, to provide for food and shelter. People need to have enough nutritious food to eat, to support themselves and their families, and to have appropriate clothing to cover themselves and protect their bodies in harsh weather conditions. They need not suffer hunger nor cold and enjoy a situation of overall well-being that can guarantee their long-term satisfaction and win their loyalty and support. As Mencius puts it, if you lighten the work in the fields and reduce their taxes, the people will be put in the condition to prosper. If you make sure that they consume food according to the appropriate season and use it abiding by ritual prescriptions, The wealth will not be exhausted. People cannot live without water and fire. If at dusk you knock at someone's door and ask for water and fire, and no one refuses to give them to you, it means there is enough of these. When a sage governs the world, he makes sure that there are both beans and grains and water and fire in equal measure. If there are both beans and grains and water and fire in equal measure, then how could there be people who are not virtuous? Once the population's most basic needs are properly taken care of and adequately satisfied, there is abundant food and commodities for everyone to enjoy. At this point, it is not only merely possible or admissible, it becomes natural to share food and commodities even with complete strangers in need and without giving it a second thought. In such ideal situation, people stop worrying about and fighting over concrete urgent necessities. This condition of relative wealth and subsistence security not only makes people more receptive to their ruler's virtuous example, it also awakens in them the inherently good inner disposition that will naturally lead them to fulfill their potential as human beings and let germinate those sprouts of virtue that, according to Mencius, are present in potency in every human being. Mencius harshly reprimands the careless behavior of the rulers of his time towards their subjects. As we can see in the dialogue he entertains with King Hui of Liang. Sorry. There we are. Yes. Dogs and swine eat human food, and you do not realize that this has to be kept under control. On the street, there lie the corpses of people who died of starvation, and you do not realize that you have to distribute food. When people die, then you say, it was not because of me, it was because of the inauspicious here. How is this any different from stabbing someone to death and then claiming, it was not me who killed him, it was the weapon? If the king will not blame it on the ear, thus all the people in the world will come to you. On several occasions, Mencius openly warns and reminds the rulers he is interacting with of the ever-impending possibility, or better say concrete ominous threat, of being overthrown because of their depraved conduct and the carelessness, meanness, and cruelty with which they treat their people. Such relentless warnings should ideally represent a constant memento for the ruler against which to check and keep under control his behavior. However, this unfortunately is not the case when it comes to the depraved sovereigns of his time. These seem to be irritated by Mencius' criticism and remain completely indifferent to, and occasionally even mildly amused about, the population's sufferings. In particular, Mencius warns rulers against the danger of neglecting the people's most basic subsistence needs, which can deeply affect their behavioral responses. Mencius said, all food tastes delicious to those who are hungry. All drinks taste sweet to those who are thirsty. And this is true even when they have not yet tasted any foods nor drinks. Hunger and thirst hurt their sense of taste. How could it possibly be that only their mouth and stomach are hurt by hunger and thirst? People's hearts are also hurt. If someone can avoid that the damage caused by hunger and thirst also hurts their heart, then indeed they should not worry that they are not as good as other people. Eventually, Mencius arrives at the point where he not only empathizes with the people's discontent caused by the miserable life conditions in which they are forced to live due to the ruler's negligence and indifference, he even justifies the inevitable consequences of the king's misconduct, the deposal of an unworthy ruler. Despite its apparent boldness, this claim might seem to have somewhat more revolutionary and modern than it actually is, or might have sounded like to a contemporary reader/user of the text, as we shall see more detail below. Mencius replied, in years of famine, among your majesty's people, the old and the weak ones who lie in ditches and water channels, and the strong ones who run away and scatter to the four corners of the world, are indeed several thousands. Still, your Majesty's granaries are full and your storehouses are filled. None of your officials has reported the situation. They are disrespectful towards their superiors and cruel towards their inferiors. From now on, the people are paying them back in the same coin. Your Majesty should not blame them. If a ruler enacts a benevolent government, his people will cherish their superiors and die for their leaders. Thus, in such an unbearable situation, people are not to blame at all if, exasperated by their poor living conditions, they eventually rebel against their superiors and react aggressively to abuse. The ruler should be understanding and lenient in their regard, for they have been cornered and forced to act in an insubordinate, subversive way by the misguided behavior of those who were supposed to provide for them and take care of them instead. Under such extreme circumstances, people are undoubtedly justified to rebel against their superiors. And again, in another passages, the features King Suen of Qi, Mencius asserts this claim in an even stronger, more straightforward manner. If a ruler makes a huge mistake, then they, the people, remonstrate. If after repeated attempts he still does not listen, then they dethrone him. There are several accounts in the Mencius that hint in a fairly explicit way that a ruler who has become unsuitable for office due to his despicable, reprehensible conduct not only might, but also can and should be deposed. But Mencius does not stop here. He goes even one step further and arrives at the point of theorizing the justifiability of regicide under extreme circumstances, as it is reported in a most famous exchange, once again with King Suen of Qi. King Suen of Qi asked Tang Benjie and King Wu attacked Zhou. Is it so? Mencius replied, according to the tradition, it is so. The king said that an official murders the ruler. Is it admissible? Mencius replied, those who act against benevolence I call thieves. Those who act against justice I call brutes. Thieves and brutes, I call these a mere common fellow. I have heard that a certain common fellow Zhou was sentenced to death, but I have not heard of a ruler being sentenced to death. After this analysis, there would seem to be sufficient grounds and evidence to postulate the existence of a proper right to rebel in the Mencius, based in our understanding of what a right actually is on Joseph Rath's definition that, quote, to say of an individual or a group that he or it has a right is to say that an aspect, or more than one, I would say, of their well-being is a ground for holding another to be under duty. Unquote. There is no doubt that for Mencius, the ruler is indeed fully responsible for his people's safety and has the moral duty to provide for them and ensure their material but also emotional and spiritual well-being. Accordingly, Mencius' view is also consistent with the reciprocity thesis, according to which members of a same community have rights inasmuch as they interact with each other according to and in respect of relationships that are defined and regulated by a social contract that is expected to advantage all members of the community. However, while it is undeniably true that Mencius is deeply sympathetic to the people's situation and living conditions, and under certain conditions fundamentally supports the forceful removal of an unrighteous ruler, this does not mean that the whole rebellious process is necessarily an extemporaneous eruption of brute force without any guidance nor control, the consequence of which would be highly unpredictable. Rebellion is not fully spontaneous. Rather, it happens because someone lets it happen, as Justin Thival has recently remarked. Rebellion is a more or less regulated process that falls perfectly within the prescribed boundaries and abides by the rules that we would expect to be promoted in a text that is closely associated with the Confucian tradition. While a rebellion or disorders, luan, always imply a component of chaos, violence, and obviously the disruption of constituted order that is cathartically necessary to establish a new one, The kind of rebellion that is prompted by Mencius and by Confucians at large is a controlled or supervised kind of luan, in which those in control eventually remain so, and instead of actually taking part in it, are rather waiting safely behind closed doors so as to safeguard governmental structures and be ready to install anyone who might be a more suitable choice. This is a convenient way of normalizing and reconciling an apparently unjustifiable rebellion within the framework of acceptable action, regulated by norms of appropriate behavior, thereby also normalizing narratives of abdication that at times do not quite fit and that actually imply a certain degree of transgression and a violent, abrupt, or unexpected interruption of consuetudinary values. We could say that rebellion is not popular, strictly speaking, though it is perpetrated by and through the people. The degree of people's satisfaction is indeed used as an index to evaluate the suitability of a ruler to the highest office, but that does not necessarily imply that the people are considered fully equipped with all the necessary skills and information, or even allowed, to judge on their own and deliberate independently on such topic of crucial importance, that is, whether a ruler should be deposed or not, and especially who should be enthroned in his stead. Hence, if people are neither capable nor allowed to think and make decisions independently regarding their own lives, the alleged right to rebel is not quite a right, as this would also imply independent evaluation skills, a strong individual conscience and awareness of the self, and an acquired and well-established capacity to promote self-centered thought. To acknowledge the people a right to rebel would mean to attribute them actual independence of thought and action and full-fledged moral and political agency, which is not quite the case in early Chinese political thought. Mencius makes it very clear that it is not the body of the people that can take such crucial decisions as overthrowing a ruler. The people are those who perform the act as a natural response that is ultimately dictated by heaven and executed through them. That being the case, what kind of role is left for the people? What is the scope and range of their political agency, and do they actually have one at all? What is the scope? People are the means and the instruments through which rebellions are orchestrated. While their popular discontent is obviously genuine, popular initiative is to a large extent guided and directed by different forces that interpret, fuel, and direct the population's discontent, including the ruling elite. However, the people's range of action is not as broad as it has been recently portrayed in several accounts of the Mencius' supposedly egalitarian, or at times even more strongly put, democratic spirit. Only authority, that is, those who already detain the power at various levels, have the right and the power to officially sanction the legitimacy of a newly established source of authority. To further problematize this alleged right to rebel in the Mencius, we need to address the issue of the actual nature, scope, and limits of human agency, and especially of the agency of the people within this context. When I talk about agency of the people, I mean what Mustafa Emir Baya and Anne Misch defined as a temporally embedded process of social engagement informed by the past in its habitual aspect, but also oriented towards the future, as a capacity to imagine alternative possibilities, and towards the present as a capacity to conceptualize past habits and future projects within the contingencies of the moment, unquote. Now that we have circumscribed the semantic field of agency, we can proceed to address a few fundamental questions, and more precisely, mean as a collective agent, mean the people as collective agent versus the individual agent. Does mean have a shared moral understanding and collective conscience? Are divergences allowed, or are these necessarily reconciled within the ecclesia of the protesters? Does mean have any actual independent agency, or are they theologically compelled and programmed to react in a certain way because heaven said so? Finally, to rebel is just, socially acceptable, and even a matter of moral duty or a proper moral imperative when society is threatened by a tyrannical ruler. But is this decision or resolution, if any, to rebel upon their choice and the outcome of a rational thought process, or is it emotional? On the basis of the passages that we have analyzed so far, we can deduce with a certain degree of certainty that mean in the Mencius is rather to be considered as a collectivity of atomized individuals who, like electrically charged particles, resonate and react in unison to a commonly perceived stimulus, and act in response to a moral imperative that is necessarily shared in virtue of their common human nature. It seems quite evident that the people are prompted to act harmoniously in unison with one voice, in virtue of that one key element that they cannot possibly ignore nor put to silence, that is their shared human nature. Human nature is what makes an individual properly human, and as such, naturally inclined to show the same kind of instinctive reaction, intrinsically natural tendency, and emotional responses to external stimuli, and at the same time to be also subjected to the satisfaction of the same fundamental basic needs that necessarily have to be met to ensure not just basic survival, but also well-being. Accordingly, we would expect a choral and fairly consistent response to the same kind of should the same kind of mistreatment be inflicted upon the people by the ruler. The Mencius also seems to imply that the people act and react synchronically as an organic whole and as one ethically consistent moral agent, despite the fact that this agent is obviously composed of individualities. However, these individuals have either undergone the same kind of hardship, injustice, or mistreatment perpetrated by the ruler, or they stand united due to an overwhelming feeling of empathy and sympathy towards the pain of their fellow human beings. In one way or another, all the individual people that are part of the people as a group eventually partake of the same emotional experience and consequently develop a communal, moral, and pragmatic response. The reactions seem to be triggered by some sort of gut feeling or unconscious instinct, rather than being the result of a pondered reflection. Could the individual possibly oppose this overwhelming moral strife, this force from within that possesses them and drives them towards what is allegedly the superior good, determined by heaven for them? The answer is yes and no at the same time. We can apply the same kind of reasoning that the Mencius employs when discussing the naturally moral inclinations of human nature. For Mencius, human nature is intrinsically good as it partakes of nature with a capital N. Hence, it is instinctively, spontaneously, and almost irresistibly driven towards a path of morality. This also means that, theoretically, anyone could deviate from the path of morality if they would, but they could not possibly want to do so in a deliberate way, which means that they eventually will not, unless some major interference is born that distances them from the inner source of their own natural tendency towards morality and distracts them from the path that they otherwise would be naturally driven towards. It really does require quite some effort to break bad and break away from what are the ethical principles that are permeating and regulating from within all aspects of someone's life and the constitutive tissue of society. Temporary deviance is accounted for, but also normalized and reconciled within the limits of acceptability as the exception to an otherwise necessarily moral way of living. Eventually, people are irresistibly driven to react in a certain way, which is inborn and in part predetermined, as it is ruled by the laws of nature and regulated by heaven. Hence, they're not fully in control of their actions, which is also why they are only partially responsible of their reactions, the more they are dominated by their instincts. Finally, it must always be kept in mind that Mencius, or better say whoever compiled the text, is ultimately a child of his time and is not promoting any proper democratic rule to be elected as the basic underlying guiding principle regulating social life at large. The kind of harmonious society the Confucian tradition aims at establishing is neither egalitarian nor democratic. It is hierarchical and strictly regulated by a set of more or less fixed behavioral and ritual rules that govern every single aspect of an individual's public and private life, determining what the appropriate behavior might be according to the circumstances and what their role is within the community they live in. Through the promotion of a basic set of 5 graded relationships and the respective moral and practical duties, Confucian thought implicitly justifies the division of labor and the existence of different social strata to be distinguished according to the equal capacities and skills of individuals, but first and foremost, their corresponding potential for moral self-perfectioning. Hence, we might conclude that the people are eventually largely unaware instruments in the hands of heaven and those who are entitled to govern them, who are supposedly acting in their best interest, rather than conscious moral agents and carriers of rights that are deliberately making decisions to ignite the rebellious process. And I will stop here for today. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Thank you for giving us this fascinating and stimulating insight into these reflections. And I think that especially in your conclusion, you make clear that the 3 elements that you put in the title of your lecture, right, civil disobedience, agency, and moral authority, are tightly connected in early Chinese philosophy, meaning that you can perform acts of civil disobedience as an initiator, right, as an agent, only if you have the moral authority to do so. Otherwise, you are just a passive actor in something that has been decided by those who have the tools, the moral and intellectual tools to do so. And I think this is also fascinating if we look at the contemporary period, because you mentioned the theories on the presumed democratic nature of Mencius' theories. But when today we see that Xi Jinping declares that China is a Minzhu, is a democracy, we are in a moment in which democracy is conceptualized in different ways. And I think that if we want to understand the current Chinese conceptualization of democracy, we also have to look at these early Chinese conceptualizations. I don't want to say that Xi Jinping is just translating into the contemporary age the early Confucian thought, but I think that if we want to have a comparative look at the theories of democracy, looking at these reflections by early Confucianists is, I think, a useful exercise to do so. Thank you very much. And now I want just to open the floor to questions by the audience, since I'm not asking you any direct question, also because I can ask you them maybe later or in another moment. But I would like to give the audience the opportunity to share their reflections or comments or questions. So please raise your hand if you have any question, or just text it in the chat. But maybe raising your hand and asking it directly is even better. Yes, Geir, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating stuff. I'm not sure exactly what sort of question I have, but I think obviously when we talk about rights and democracy, we are talking about fairly recent notions also in Western culture. And I don't think if we go back to Aristotle or Plato, I don't think it makes much sense to talk about rights in those periods. So maybe it's a little bit unfair, you know, to expect to find them in in the Mencius, or in Confucius. But I think there is certainly something we can find in these writings that can be developed, and and so maybe we should also focus on those shimmers of hope in those texts that can be developed into something for the people, so to speak, and I guess I do have actually a few questions, but I'm just going to maybe ask one, and I want to ask you about your sort of thought on Tianming also, because I've always thought about Tianming somehow almost in a Buddhist sense of having like a dual sort of truth in a way, in the sense that obviously you refer to, with Tianming, you are referring to the natural forces. I mean, Tian could also be understood as a kind of a mystical thing. There was always this sort of hazy religious aspect of Tianming, even though it's very unclear. But it also simply refers to what happens. Like natural catastrophes have, of course, always been present in China and very common. And so if we think about Tianming as it has sort of played itself out in the dynasties that followed, when the dynasties were toppled, it usually happened after some terrible natural catastrophes, or and there would be a rebellion or something like that. Yeah. And then the question is, why is that? Was Tian was it somehow doing what's the word? Was Tian doing something, retaliating for the behavior of the ruler or something like that? Well, I mean, in a way, yes, probably not consciously, but it's good to have that option, But basically, what happens is that the ruler is not really taking care, is not making any precautions, is not really looking after the dikes, is not having reserve food, and not being ready for what happens. So actually, what the ruler is doing is not doing his job, which is supposed to take care of the people and be ready. So when this happens, and it's happening all the time, then of course it's going to be a catastrophe. So, so from that point of view, it's seen as Tianming, like the ruler lost his Tianming because he was not really doing his job. And in the Mengzi, you have this very wonderful passage as well in chapter 5, I think, where it says, "Heaven sees from the point of view of my people, and heaven hears from the point of view of my people." So in some ways, how the people actually experience the situation is how Tian is experiencing the situation. So in some ways, there is a kind of at least an inkling of lending agency to the people through Tian.
Yeah, no, I think you've made very good points, and it would be fascinating to talk more about Tianming, because it has all these different components and aspects, of course. And in a certain way, these disastrous events are actually a way in which the heaven is poking the ruler and say, look, watch out, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And that also implies the fact, look, you are not defending the people appropriately, and I can show you, because I can hit you because you're not taking care of public works, for instance, as you should. So you're not really thinking forward as you should be. And of course, it is true that it's not that the people are completely powerless and not just puppets. And also because in a certain way, it really seems that what is happening is heaven is really taking care of the people. And in the end, who has the most dangerous position is the ruler, because he's there, but only as long as he does his job properly. Yes. And it's not like constitutively different from the other people for heaven. So it's not some kind of, so he has this godlike aura just because he's invested with the mandate, but he is basically a primus inter pares, is also a human being, and heaven is taking care of everybody equally, is just expressing himself preferentially through the ruler. But of course, what seems to be at the core of what heaven does is providing for, or trying to take care of the people through the ruler. So that's exactly what happens. And of course, in a certain way, their discontent or their, on the opposite side, the well-being is a reflection of also what heaven is experiencing. Heaven is kind of modulating the reactions in a way that it is possible to transmit it, to transmit this message to the ruler. So it's kind of triangular relationship that goes through the three elements, I would say. Yeah, thank you very much, Geir.
Excellent, yeah.
So other questions? In the meantime, I would like also to follow up on what Geir said, and I think that we really should look at how Mencius also conceptualizes the idea of action differently from what, as Geir said, we find in Greek philosophy, for example. And there's constant references to the natural world and this blurred distinction between inner action and outer action, then definitely gives even the people some kind of agency, because it's a natural agency, maybe it's a resonance somehow, but it still can be considered as a form of agency. I think this is a very interesting comparative reflection as well. Yuri Ines has raised his hand. Please.
Yes, I'm sorry, I shall not open my camera because the speed of the internet in China is a little bit slower. So I hope that now you will hear me without seeing. It is okay. Now, thank you very much. I want just to make, I think that I agree with much of your interpretation. I want to add a little bit a historian's point of view on both aspects, on the heaven and the people. First, about heaven, it is very important to notice that we have three different concepts of the mandate of heaven. We have the Western Jaw, very serious, very religious concept of the really the foundation of the legitimacy of the political power is on heaven. Then we have the same, or not the same, but quite close idea in the Western Han onwards, when the idea of heaven is resurrected. But in between, in the Eastern Jaw, from the Chunshu period, the idea of heaven, it does not disappear, but it is very much sidelined. And because there is no real candidate to say, I am ready to unify all under heaven. So there is no mandate of heaven as it was conceptualized in the Western Jaw. And when Mengzi invokes heaven, he does it in a very funny way, because he does it in the world where, except of Modzi, who is really an exception here, nobody seriously discusses the idea of heaven's mandate, because, you know, for hundreds of years, there was no any claimant of the heaven's mandate, or not the claimant in this Western Jaw idea of a universal rule. So I would add immediately why I pointed, but the second point is the people. It is very interesting that during the Warring States period, we don't have any evidence of mass people's actions against the government from below. We have a lot in the Chunshu period. We have the capital dwellers. They are not exactly the commoners. They are low aristocracy. They are the Guoren, who mentions them. And people, usually they are translated as people of the state. They are not people of the state. They are dwellers of the capital. They make a lot of troubles to the rulers in the Chunshu period. In the Warring States period, almost none. There is actually no evidence at all. Now, Mengzi takes two moribund ideas, the people and heaven, and then he uses them to correct the ruler, to teach the ruler that, please heed me, please do good things. If you don't, people and heaven together will punish you. And this is exactly what Du Weiming noticed many years ago. The Chinese intellectuals, they wanted to appropriate the power of heaven and the power of the people in order actually to empower themselves against the rulers. So this is close to your conclusion, but from a historical line of analysis.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Yuri. I actually, it's fascinating how the philosophical perspectives complies with what the historical data is actually telling us, the historical information are telling us. And I actually, well, we could for the moment, I wanted also to expand on also the discussion of what mean actually means, and if it's actually people and everything. And then I decided it would go on for too long. But yeah, it was also problematizing the concept of mean would also be very important, because the discourse that you make about war and what means in different periods is also something, but maybe for another talk would be very interesting to address, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, there are questions. Halvor, Paul Golden.
Oh, because I probably my system is not refreshing adequately, so I don't see any raised hands.
Okay.
So please, whoever has raised his or her hand, please.
Oh, that's Paul.
Okay, I see Paul Golden.
I'll just jump in. Okay. May I?
Yes.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll leave my camera off for the same reasons as everyone else. Lisa, your paper reminds me a little bit of quantum physics, in that there's a macro view and a micro view, and they look a little bit different. So the macro view is this large question that Yuri is interested in: what happens to the concept of heaven's mandate? It seems to be very prominent in the Western Joe, then it seems to be much less prominent in the Eastern Joe. That requires a book or more to deal with. The micro view is what's going on in Mencius. And there, I think it's pretty clear that the concept of heaven's mandate is brought to bear indirectly, and it's highly problematic. The problem is, if you believe in it, we shouldn't be in the middle of the warring states. We should have a sage king. And there are a couple of hints. One is that it's been more than 500 years. Every 500 years, we're supposed to have a new sage king. It's been about 700 years. What's going on? Mencius even says, and yeah, so first of all, what happened 500 years after the founding of the Western Joe? Confucius was born. So I've always believed that one of the purposes of this 500-year cycle in Mencius was to advance this idea of Confucius as the uncrowned king, because the timing is just too uncanny. But even if you don't accept that, this whole all this hand-wringing about the fact that it's been 500 years, and then the inference that Mencius draws is that heaven doesn't yet want us to have a sage king. We don't really understand why, but it has to be attributable to heaven, because no human being could have brought about the situation that we're in. And so we're left to try to figure out why there's such chaos. Heaven doesn't seem to think we're worthy yet, or explain its processes to us yet. I don't think any of that is comprehensible without assuming that the world of thought at that time well understands the concept of heaven's mandate. And if it seems to be absent, it's because the text, and Mencius is not the only one, is just laden with anxiety over the fact that the doctrine is not being borne out by reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It's a very good point, because it seems like heaven is punishing us and we don't really understand why. And of course, it's a vicious circle, because then if heaven doesn't produce a sage or a true king, then of course the world will remain in the state of disorder. So to break out of the cycle, you actually need to have someone who is given the mandate, who is clearly showing this kind of exceptional qualities. So that is a very good point. And this is something that I really noticed while writing this paper, that I realized, okay, so nobody is really talking about these things. Why is this going on? But it is true that it's clearly problematic, and the fact that it's not talked about already makes it present somehow in the discourse in a negative way, of course. So that is also something very, very interesting to explore. And of course, the fact that nobody talks about it and then suddenly pops up and says, oh, we have to that's why I'm talking about the revival of these things, because it's trying to bring them back in the discourse, but it's also basically the only one.
From a more macro view, and just a quick follow-up, and then I'll mute myself. On the more macro view, which as I said, you would have to plot a whole book in order to address that.
Yeah,
One strategy I would
talk.
take, absolutely. I wouldn't recommend that for a talk. One strategy I would take is to explore the idea that heaven's mandate is reinterpreted in Eastern Zhou sources as a personal gift from heaven that all human beings receive, as opposed to the status of son of heaven that only a single human being receives. And then you can make sense of concepts like the four beginnings in Mencius, concepts in the Guardian manuscripts and in Xunzi about what capacities we have received from heaven. Xunzi is also reluctant to talk about heaven's mandate, but not reluctant to talk about Tian. There's all kinds of faculties that we receive from Tian, and it's almost anaphoric. The repetition of this attribute Tian, we have our Tian this, our Tian that, our Tian the other thing, is designed to make it pretty clear to the reader that we have received this from Tian. So that is a kind of an individualized mandate, and it's up to you to decide how to configure that within the larger intellectual world. But maybe this is a response to the fact that there is no worthy Tianzi. So the only way we can talk about heaven's mandate in a believable, plausible way is to reduce it to the level of the individual, where there are some people who do seem to be worthy of the mandate that they've received from heaven.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good point, and also, it's a very good point. Also, the Xunzi talks extensively about Tian, and then also, of course, you have the chapter Tianzhi, which I didn't want to bring into the discussion because otherwise it would have really become too much. But that's definitely how also Tian is is expressed in different ways and analyzed in different ways, but it's still very much present. Even if Tianming is so secondary, it's also something that is very interesting to look at. And the difference between the Xunzi and Mencius is striking, especially in the way in which they deal with it. And also this idea that maybe having this more focused perspective on the individual, because we do have proof of course, individual people being moral or ethical against, especially, and they stand out especially against this kind of total war situation where everybody is just thinking have this very utilitaristic kind of way of behaving for their own interests. So that is also a very interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Now I can see Halvor Eifring's raised hand, so please.
Okay, I will try. Thank you very much for interesting.
Hi. Thank you.
And I have a question that may have some bearing on the question of the agency of the people. It seemed from what you said that you think that sort of their actions are more or less sort of irresistible, just reflexes to whatever heaven has endowed them with. Though there is, maybe not in connection with the people, but at least in connection with the rulers like Liang Hui Wang, and also the idea that you have to sort of take whatever emotion or whatever commiseration or whatever feeling you have for something, for instance, the ox that was going to be taken to the slaughter to be slaughtered, that you have to sort of expand on those kinds of emotions so that it's not as if you automatically become sort of just neither a virtuous person nor perhaps even a good rebel, just sort of automatically, but you sort of need to expand on those properties that are already present as or as a kind of latent, in a latent form, but not necessarily manifest. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's so. I think we need to distinguish here the fact that so the moment in which you start to actually proactive acting on your emotions, you have already decided to somehow get into this path of self-perfectioning. So it already implies some sort of higher engagement in this moral process of moralizing yourself or making yourself a better human being, which is not necessarily accessible to everyone, even if we hope that if everybody is put in the ideal conditions, everybody would follow along. And then you have also this component, of course, that Mencius is trying to push the rulers, these rulers with whom he's talking, to somehow follow these kind of principles, to try to make themselves into better human beings. It is true that interpreting or regulating emotions would be necessary at a certain more advanced level. It's something that, of course, require also intellectual capacity being involved. So the way in which people react to emotions or elaborate emotions also vary according to the degree of self-perfectionment that they have achieved. And of course, the Junzi, so the ideal ruler or a true king, is supposed to have reached the highest possible degree. And that is also why Mencius would ideally be expecting that degree of intellectual refinement also from a true ruler, though not necessarily from the people. Let's say that people have the potential, but not everybody can become a Junzi, so to say. But of course, there is also the component that it's not completely, so even the people who are more driven by their emotions, they're not brutes. They also have the capacity to think. It seems that in this particular case, they are really much more having a reaction like seeing the kid who is falling into the well. So it's something that is almost uncontrollable. It's a kind of instinctive reaction, and it has a very strong emotional component rather than some kind of intellectual elaborations, though people are also capable of intellectual elaboration, of course, in thinking. So I think that in this case is more the kind of emotional reaction, but it's, of course, in this discourse, we should also entangle the question of free will, and that was a bit too much for today, and that's maybe a good topic for another talk, because that's pretty huge, but that's also a component that we have to problematize after looking at this and this influence that heaven exercised on people, through the people. So what is really the range of is there free will? What is the level of independent agency? And Erica Brinkley's talk also about this in her book quite extensively, but this is also something that really deserves more attention, I think. Thank you so much. I don't know if I've answered your question.
You certainly, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have time for another question, at least. See if someone wants to participate. Or I will just ask you a quick question that came to my mind. I mean, if you are the initiator of an act of civil disobedience, do you have also the duty, or are you suggested also to explain to the people that participate in this act the reasons, so the moral reason behind it? Is there any passage in the Monza that comes to your mind in which leaders, let's say so, communicate to the people the reasoning behind that act? And because I think this would also help us better understand the agency, or even the limited agency of the mean when participating. I was just curious about that, if you have any passage in mind or any restrictions.
This is a very good point. And as far as I know, there's no real... So usually first of all, it's not the ruler that communicates, for instance, directly with the people. There's always some officials, some other people who have the duty to deal with the people, because the ruler is supposed, just to sit there and everything is done, and he just exudes virtue, has this aura, and is just positively influencing everyone, even by doing nothing. So the ruler would never really has this kind of direct intellectual exchange. There is really this kind of separation between the people. We're always talking about the people, but as we don't belong to the people. So there's always this kind of very controlling kind of perspective that Mencius has. He's clearly putting himself in the situation of those who govern over the people. So there is, I wouldn't say that there is any direct reference. I would have to check, but as to my knowledge, I don't think there's any case in which we really explain, which of course would have happened to a certain degree, because we would have decrees and these ordinances and everything. But it's
or maybe I was thinking also about speeches by these leaders or people who commit acts of rebellion.
May I interfere for a second, Yuri?
Yes, sure.
You have it in the most famous citation, which everybody cited today, when Mengzi cites, heaven sees what the people see, and heaven hears from what the people hear. It is from the Great Harang, from the declaration of rebellion by King Wu of Zhou against the last king of the Shang. So Mengzi cites it. It is you speak to your people why you decide to overthrow the dynasty. It should not be, of course, the historical real speech, but there was a genre, and Martin Kern exposes it. There was a genre of harangues, of the oaths, of the proclamations on the eve of rebellion, that you need to convince your people why you do rebel. And Mengzi at least cites twice this text, so you have it indirectly, but you do have it.
Okay, yeah.
Thank
you.
And we have Laura Lettere.
Yes.
Question.
Hello, everyone. I have a very quick question. If this presentation was held in person, I would ask it like during the coffee break. So it's like very marginal.
Please go ahead.
In the your biography note, and also Federico mentioned it at the very beginning of the presentation, that your main attempt is to bridge philosophy and philology. As this is very close to what I think I would like to do, I just wanted to ask you some reference, like a work that inspires you in this respect, or some like reference in theory or methodology that you find particularly useful on this aspect.
Well, that is a very broad topic, but let me see how to frame this. So what I actually try to do, so I'm not the traditional philologist, also because it seems that claiming to be a philologist is a bad thing these days. But of course I have a philological background, but what has always interested me is basically using philology as a tool to address philosophical texts in a rigorous way, because so much is said about the content of these texts without really relying on the text. And there's a lot of speculation that could be fascinating, but if we don't really stick to what the text is saying, then we're talking nonsense. And also it's what I also do, and it is part of this discourse, is looking at the content is framed and how textual structure influence the way in which a text is constructed, and there's this mutual relationship between content and text structure, how they interact, and why certain textual structure are used, and what kind of communicative effect they have, and how they influence the way in which a text is perceived, for instance. So this is more or less what I do, very briefly. One of the things I do. Well, for sure, I would say, well, it depends if you're interested more in this kind of textual studies, or there are for sure attempts There's the work by Dirk Meyer, for instance, Martin Kern, Paul Goldin, who is in our audience. I don't know. Europeans has also been doing this. There's a group of people right now, that Joachim Gans as well. There's a group of people that is working on trying to bridge these two fields and making them more integrated, more consistent. I can for sure send you a few inspirational texts from where you can start, of course. I think I don't know exactly in which period do you work. I think you work more on Buddhism, or I might be wrong.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we can talk later. I can send you something via email, of course.
I'll appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. So if there are no further questions or comments, I think we can thank Lisa for her talk, for answering to our questions, and for this very stimulating discussions. And I would like to invite you to our next event in 10 days, exactly March the 26th, at 2 p.m. Central European Time. Ralf Weber from the University of Basel will talk about an interdisciplinary approach to Chinese philosophy. As always, you will receive a reminder one day before the event, together with the YouTube link of today's event. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.